Many years ago, I went to work for the Milwaukee Brewers. It was a very interesting process to be hired to be the potential partner of Bob Uecker, Mr. Baseball. And I remember that first dinner I had with Bob, where he was really gracious, was funny, of course, as always. He can't help himself, but I was nervous, and he knew it. But we got through it. It was a good meal, and ultimately they did hire me. So a few days after that, we were at spring training in Phoenix, and it was time to do some recordings. We had needed to do some liners for our various affiliates on the Brewers Radio Network, as well as many other recordings. And before the gentleman who was going to sort of run all this whole process of all these recordings got there, Bob and Kent Sommerfeld, who's our longtime producer engineer, great man, they were kind of joking around that this guy that's coming to help us is really good at his job, but he's got really bad breath. And so they were just laughing and they were cutting up about it. And I'm like, I'm still petrified because I barely even know these guys. But anyway, so the gentleman finally does arrive and we start doing some recordings, and he's leaning over people's shoulders to look at the copy, and Euchre's giving these knowing glances around the room and all that. And so everybody was having fun in their own way, except this gentleman didn't. We were careful not to insult him. But anyway, so we did some recordings, and then we decided we were going to take a break. So the gentleman left the room from the Brewers, and it was just the three of us, and we chatted for a little bit, and then we went back to the recordings. But when he came back in, the representative from the Brewers, I wandered over by him, and I said, hey, I'm just chatting with him for a second, and I said, hey, I'm going to get a breath mint here. I happen to have some in my pocket. Would you like one? And he said, sure, that'd be great. And unbeknownst to me, because I was petrified to look at Kent and Bob, those two were rolling in the floor, that I actually was able to get this guy to have a breath mint, and they thought that was just perfect. That was kind of my icebreaker with the Brewers and the Brewers Radio Network. Shortly thereafter, we did our first spring training game, and Bob could see I was very nervous about that. And he said something to me that I've never forgotten, and that he truly lived the whole time I knew him in his life. And that is, he said, look, it's a baseball game. We're just going to have a few laughs. We're just going to have some fun. I don't care about nothing. So you just relax. We're going to have a good time. Enjoy yourself. And that's pretty much the edict that I took as my marching orders throughout my 13 years with Bob Uecker. And boy, he was true to his word the whole time. One thing I had to learn right away was what life was going to be like with Bob Uecker as my partner. Obviously, nobody knew who I was, and everybody knew who the number one was, and that was Bob Uecker. But I didn't know till we went on the first road trip exactly what I was in for. We pulled up at the hotel on the team bus outside New York, outside our New York hotel, and the players get up and they start, disembarking from the bus. And I'm sitting in the back with Kent Sommerfeld. We're not going anywhere. We're waiting for everybody else. And after a while, we realized that all the players had gotten off. There's a huge throng of people. There's autograph seekers. There's cameras. The fans are all over the place, as they always are in New York. And so the players were going out, but I noticed they were just kind of walking by the fans. They weren't really stopping. And then at some point, I realized all the players were off the bus, and I knew what the fans were waiting for. They weren't waiting for the players. They weren't looking for the players' autographs or the pictures. They were waiting for Bob Uecker. And thus began my education on what it's like to be around someone so good, so talented, and so famous. So a lot of people ask me, why did Bob stay in Milwaukee? Why would you stay in Milwaukee where everybody in the entire state knows you instantly? You can't go to the grocery. You can't fill up your car with gas. We knew other teams had been trying to lure Bob away from the Brewers, thinking the Brewers are paupers and they don't have enough money, and we can certainly outbid them, and we'll get Bob Uecker, George Steinbrenner being a notable example. We'll get Bob Uecker here to New York, and he'll come work for the Yankees, and he'll be my guy. And he asked Bob repeatedly, and Bob was always polite, and he always turned them down. Because one thing Bob never did was he never forgot his roots. He was born and raised in Milwaukee. He's from a blue-collar background, and in this day and age, people are busy and they're on their phones and they're not paying attention. They're disrespectful. A lot of my friends say, I don't even really like to socialize anymore. You just never know what you're going to be talking to or what you're going to bump into. But one thing about Bob is he never thought about things like that. Bob Uecker loves people. And that's why he stayed in Milwaukee, because those were his people. He loves the blue-collar people. He doesn't care if you're rich or you're poor, if you're in a wheelchair or you're walking. He doesn't care if you're a Brewers fan or not. If you meet Bob Uecker, you are instant friends with him. And that's how I know for sure, Bob, when his spirit passed yesterday, which is still a little fresh for a lot of us, that he went straight to heaven, because nobody can influence that many people on a constant basis, day in, day out, making the world a better place and not end up in heaven. Plus, I know that God is sitting up there probably already mad at himself for making Bob wait almost 91 years. And he was ready for his turn. So I'm sure Bob went right to the left-hand side of our Heavenly Father. And they're probably sitting back right now making fun of me doing this podcast talking about Bob, if I know Bob at all. But that's the way things go when you're working with Bob. In closing for now, first of all, I want to mention we're going to have a special Fans First podcast that's coming in the very near future, in which we deal with nothing but Bob Uecker stories from the people who know him best. So look for that episode to be coming up down the road. I want to leave you with this also, more of a personal note. Bob was by far the best broadcast teammate that I ever had. But more importantly, he was one of my very best friends in my life. He was also one of my most important and trusted confidants, and someone who loved my wife, Emmy, and my 3 daughters unconditionally, always welcomed them into our booth. And also, by the way, just as a sidebar, kind of a little bonus, he's the funniest son of a gun in the entire world. No one has ever graced this planet who has more natural humor than Bob Uecker. He can kill any crowd. But you know what I loved best about Bob? He was one that never cracked a joke that was laced with profanity to try and shock an audience into laughing. Anybody can do that, Bob felt. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't articulate, that he looked down on other comedians. But the fact that he could kill a huge crowd over and over and never utter a profane word, unlike all the other comics that I see anyway, the F-bombs flying everywhere, that was not Bob's style. And I think he was very proud that not only was he good at comedy, but he could do it in the right way. But please, if you have time, go on the internet. If you're a little older, you're a little younger, and maybe you weren't around when Bob was in his heyday, do some searching. Laugh your butt off. You'll love it. And in a couple of weeks, we'll have an episode with nothing but Uecker's thoughts and stories, and it's going to be a classic. So thank you so much for indulging me to let me tell you a little bit about Bob Uecker that you might otherwise not know. A guy who loves people no matter where they come and what their walk of life was, and never forgot where he was coming from, no matter how famous he got.